Welcome to Authentically Debz, my podcast. A Southern girl looks at 70. So, moving on, but still mentioning Dr. Good, he did possibly save my life by putting me in Arkansas Psychiatric Hospital, the psych ward, so that my husband wouldn't kill me because I could not help but talk about another man's penis 24/7. He did not even come close to the correct diagnosis of OCD, surprisingly, but I mean it was definitely around then and had a name, but no one that treated me then ever mentioned it, which after much life experience, including what often felt like constant agony for me for years, and made some wild and often horrible decisions during that time. Years later, I finally self-diagnosed after doing a lot of research myself. I believe I was in my early to mid 40s, and at that time I got my current shrink to heartily agree with the OCD diagnosis. I am on medication for it and have been for years, and could probably get off the medication. I know my psychiatrist has offered it as a possibility, even suggested it, but I just don't feel like rocking the boat. And I don't really think it would rock the boat because I have truly learned to cope with the help of some good therapy, with just life experience and developing my own coping mechanisms, and of course the medication. At this point, before I go further, I want to digress. I think I've already done it a little bit, but momentarily, possibly again, back to my then young husband. Because of him, I had also, prior and in between my bouts of OCD flare-ups, been a victim several times at his hands of domestic abuse. I mentioned earlier that he was an alcoholic and that he had seizures and he suffered from the depression to the point of being suicidal to the use of pills when I had broken up with him once when I was in high school prior to our marriage. Why on earth did I ever marry him? Sometimes you just have to play things out. I'm through doing that, thank goodness. But I have more to share about playing things out. Actually, I've been through with that for a while now. I'd say close to 20 years. Yay me. But when he was drunk, I remember once being thrown across the kitchen. And I've often thought, it's like, after that happened, I might have pushed it to the back of my head with the OCD taking precedence, but I would never, and I don't like to say never, but I would not ever stay with the person who chronically, or even, now, abused me at all, emotionally or physically. Because you know what? I was not raised having anyone, and especially a man, throw me around, physically abuse me. My father didn't ever physically abuse me. He kind of emotionally abused me when he was drunk after 3 martinis, but that was so infrequent. I never saw him hardly. But had I grown up being or watching my mother and father, or especially if I'd grown up watching my mother get abused physically, I might have been more inclined to stay. I mention that because his second wife did stay with him for 25 years. And according to my children who were with her for a goodly period of time, I hate to admit, she was beaten up continually by him. And I think the only reason she stayed is because I do understand that she did grow up seeing her parents in action and seeing her father abuse her mother. I think that becomes very cyclical in abuse situations. So there was just no way I was really ever going to stay with him, because if he changed, it certainly wasn't going to be for me, and I certainly wasn't going to wait around until he did. Also, a little more about him. He was short. I'm only 5'2". He couldn't have been more than 5'4" or 5'5", but he was a football running back, and he was short but stout. And he had really grown up fighting other kids his age. I think he kind of had a Napoleonic complex, plus a very fucked up father. And I'm sure he got probably teased a lot because he was small, so he made up for it by being the best fighter in his class. But sadly, if he ever did not win one of those fights, he shared with me that his crazy father was waiting at home to beat the shit out of him if he had lost, really. Which brings me to his father, now long time deceased. I believe he died at age 55. Ronnie had watched his dad physically abuse his sweet mother almost all of his young life. And again, that's one reason he thought it was okay to try to do it to me. I know that Ronnie adored his mother, but as he got older and wanted his dad to stop abusing his mother, he probably wanted to take his father on physically. But remember, Ronnie, unless he won his fights as a kid, he was regularly beaten up by his father himself. And even when he fought back, he never won. So as bad as I'm sure he hated watching his father assault his mother, as far as I know, he never stepped in to try and stop it. It was self-survival for him. But at what cost? I mean, so fucked up. But that was the damaged human being I was living with and trying to learn to cope with life with OCD through therapy, which actually did help my mental illness, and I began to get healthier. At that point, the doctors pretty much gave up on medication for me because since they didn't ever get to the right diagnosis, none of it worked anyway. And this would follow. As it turned out, the healthier I became, the more insecure my good old boy husband became. At this time, I was going to group therapy twice a week. I was seeing a private psychologist once a week. And Arkansas Psychiatric Hospital had what they called marathons. And boy, were they fun. That's when they would take us or invite us to go for a weekend up at a beautiful lake in Arkansas, maybe an hour out of Little Rock. And we would really just have group sessions for most of the weekend. Great food, beautiful scenery, lots of relaxation. And I remember that my ex-husband was really beginning to flip out about this. Now I was gone for a whole weekend with people he didn't know and doctors he didn't know or psychologists he didn't know. And since I had spent well over a year talking about a doctor's penis, I'm sure he was, in his emotional disturbance, was very bothered by it. And I remember at one of those marathons, which we went to every few months, he showed up. No spouse. Just the patients were invited to these things. And he showed up kind of angry and just kind of wanting to see what was going on. And I was in such a good space when he arrived that I just let him know that you're not supposed to be here. This is weird. You need to leave. And he did. He didn't like it, I'm sure, but he did leave. Let's see. Now, at that point in our lives, I had the money, what there was of it, because both of my parents had died, and although neither were rich, they both left me, being an only child, whatever money in their estate that they had. Now, my mother's side at that time did have some oil royalty monthly income payments that I would get, which is now dwindled to nothing. Back when I lived in Haynesville, my family had originally lived in this little community, even smaller than Haynesville, even smaller than Summerfield, where my grandfather lived, Papa, called Relief, Louisiana. And they struck oil on that land. And so my mother's side of the family moved to the big little town of Haynesville. And so I would get oil royalty checks that were, well, never over $1,000 a month, but pretty substantial, back in the day. So, and I think I mentioned, if not, I did buy us a mobile home, not a new mobile home, a used mobile home, with some of this wonderful money that was, I'm saying this tongue-in-cheek, that I was left. My now ex-husband's wild man father had died of a heart attack at 55, and his wonderful mother would soon succumb to cancer. She stayed with him. I think he settled down a lot and didn't beat her up anymore because he knew, my ex-husband's father knew what a jewel she was. And, sometimes when a spouse dies, their spouse follows them in death later. And that's what happened here. I don't necessarily think it was because she missed him so much, because I think she was really looking forward to her new life. But unfortunately, she didn't get to live it, at least not this time around. And he had one younger sister, and frankly, nobody had any money yet on their side. One thing I can say about him, though, is that he was always a good businessman. I mean, he shared some of this with me. Like when he was a kid and he had a paper route, he would sub out his paper route as a boy to other boys. And so he started a small business. He was very entrepreneurial. One of my grandchildren, my oldest granddaughter, is like that. So post our divorce, unfortunately, out of which I should have reserved rights to his then fledgling business, but when I left, I never asked for anything. And since then, he has become quite wealthy. Definitely, I would say multimillionaire. And for the sake of his third wifey, he has settled down in a big way. Apparently, and I'm sure he no longer throws wives across the room or punches them out or regularly beats them up like he did his second wife of 25 years. And this is interesting. When she left him and tried to get half, since she had always worked in their business, and that was one of the minor reasons, very minor reasons for our divorce, that he would never let me work in the business, because he had a partner then whose wife was crazier than me. And if I came into the business, then she would want to come in, and Ronnie, my ex, he just couldn't fathom that. So he managed to keep me out, which did not make me happy at all. But when she left him after 25 years and tried to get half of what he owned, what they had grown together, she could not get decent representation, legal representation in the divorce, because what my ex-husband did, it's not funny. It's really tacky, and that's using a euphemism. He hired every divorce attorney in the state of Arkansas, which left her with really not much to choose from for representation. She did end up getting $1 million as a settlement, but imagine what she should have had. I have come to see him, especially now, full circle, as a coward and a loser, which he probably always was. And when I met him, I was just too young to see it. And really, what did I have to compare it to? I had no father figure. And now this current wife, his third, he has told me that she has more money than him. So he doesn't feel like there's ever a chance he's going to be, tried to be taken advantage of. But I'm not so sure of that. But, even if he did have more money than her, Ronnie never leaves a woman. They always have to leave him. Okay, after digressing a little on my ex-husband, getting back to my beginning recovery from my last bout and my only hospitalization with my mental illness of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, at that point still undiagnosed, I was finally beginning to respond to therapy in a big way. And although I was still undiagnosed, I was learning better coping mechanisms for living with whatever mental illness I had. And I mentioned that I had private therapy now once a week with a different therapist named Bud. And I mentioned to you what he had told me about you can feel crazy, think crazy, but don't act crazy. He also told me that I was not psychotic, and that was news. That was news to me. I was glad to hear it. He said I was the most neurotic patient he had ever had, but I wasn't psychotic. So I guess what I learned, in spite of a lack of any diagnosis, was that I learned from that therapy and my applying it to my life to always move forward rather than obsessing and compulsing. I mean, I still did it, but I just kept going forward. In other words, I could feel it, think it, but I couldn't talk about it. I couldn't act it out, which would have sent me back to the psych ward and eventually God knows where. And I think I've already told you that I believe in reincarnation. And now I will tell you that I know, I can't prove it, so I guess you can't call it a fact, that in my last lifetime, or maybe one of my last lifetimes, I died in a mental institution. I really think it was my last lifetime. I was an actor. I was rich and famous, but very messed up, and I died in a mental institution. And even this lifetime, I visited one for 2 weeks. That won't happen again. And now returning to the subject of my private shrink back then, Bud. And I also mentioned that at the same time that I was seeing him privately, I did start back to school as a teacher. It wasn't easy, but it was harder not to do it than to do it, so I did it. Being a special educator, I was teaching in what we call junior high, middle school today, and I had a group of behavior disordered kids. Looking back, most of them had ADHD and certainly some learning disabilities, but no way should they have been in a classroom that they had to stay in all day, a special day class, as we call it, an SDC class. And did I also say that most of them were also African American? This was Arkansas in the 70s, so the schools were finally integrated. But most of my class were African American, and there was something wrong with that picture. Just like today, I teach incarcerated youth, and almost all of them are Black or brown. And so there continues to be something wrong with that picture. Racism does continue. Also, they had corporal punishment in the schools back then. This is something I'm quite ashamed of. I remember I got licks and I really hated it. But there was a girl in my class that was so rude and obnoxious to me and was African American. And I think if looks could kill, I would be dead and wouldn't be talking to you now, because she was not at all fond of me. I don't necessarily know why. She never, physically assaulted me or anything, but she just became so outrageous verbally. And I don't know exactly if she did anything else with another student. I'm not sure, but I took her to the office and I was allowed to give her licks, and I did. I was given a paddle by the assistant principal, who was also amazingly African American, and I gave her 5 hard licks on her behind. And I'm sure she was ready to kill me, and I don't blame her. That happened, and it shouldn't have. Also, I just happened at this time to be about 8 months pregnant, and it was toward the end of the school year, and I remember fondly that my students loved touching my big belly, and sometimes they got to see and feel the baby move, which still remains to this day one of the most special things in my life was feeling my child move inside of me and actually watching it, and sometimes seeing a little footprint. It was just amazing and was so wonderful to know that your child was alive in there in the womb. So being 25 and 8 months pregnant and getting mentally healthier, it seemed by the day at that point, I had decided that in about a week I was just going to end my school year, that my baby was due mid-June, and it was at least mid-May, and I was tired. But I was also seeing this private therapist. So I went to see him one day, and I had grown almost obsessively attracted to him by this time. He was helping me. He was an attractive man, and he was smart, and he was so different from my ex-husband, who was not my ex-husband at that point. And I saw him one day, and I remember telling him quite bravely, if I do say so myself, that day, that I wanted to have sex with him. I said this to him in one of our sessions, and I meant it. And I thought that there was a chance that he would take me up on it. But fortunately for me and him, he fragilely turned me down, saying, as I recall, that he was flattered. Remember, he said that, but that he was married. So he didn't hurt my feelings. He just said he was flattered and he was married. He didn't say, I'm very attracted to you, which would have been unprofessional, but he didn't say I'm not. And looking back, thank God he didn't take me up on my offer, but I remember leaving his office that day at the end of our session, not feeling bad at all or embarrassed, feeling very proud of myself for having asked. And that's the truth. I was hot shit then, or so I thought. Indeed, I was growing, truly. Well, soon I did file for divorce from Ronnie, and I remember that I decided to tell him over the phone. And with that information, of course, he became very drunk and then threatened to come home and kill me and the two girls. My two little daughters, who were, I guess, probably 5 and 1. Why does it never occur to these assholes to just kill themselves? So, after calling the police first, which seemed to do me no good at the time, then I called his parents. And I remember his mother told me that I could come over there, but he was their blood. Yeah, right. I don't know that it would be any different today regarding the police in Arkansas, but I rarely, if ever, visit Arkansas. Usually my family back there comes here to SoCal, and I don't ever visit Louisiana, which is where I was born. I might go to New Orleans again one day, which I think I mentioned is like another planet from the rest of the state. Anyway, getting back to that horrible day, after my now ex-husband had threatened to come to our house and shoot me and my 2 kids, to kill us, in fact, I grabbed both of them. I got into my then new Pontiac car, and we drove around and around and around Little Rock all day until it was almost dark. And when I finally dared to come home at dusk, there was my husband waiting for me in his big old pickup truck with his gun rack, of course. And he was just in the midst of, once he saw me, starting the truck up and commencing to drive the truck through the carport into and through the kitchen. But as I live and breathe today, the local police actually pulled up right behind me. I guess they were following me. It blew me away. He saw them. He was dead drunk, but he did see them. There is a God. And I remember that the police asked him if he had said what I told him he said about killing us, me and the girls. And instead of just lying and saying no, he was so drunk that he foolishly became physically confrontational with the police. And although the police knew his family, I was afraid that they wouldn't do anything to him. They did take his ass to jail, and for a few days, because his parents couldn't pay the bail money, and I sure as hell wasn't going to. I was at least that healthy. So when he sobered up, the police did tell him that the arrest had been with my permission. So suffice to say that after that, I had no more trouble with Ronnie with the divorce. I guess that's not quite true, but basically, no more trouble. I want to mention one more thing about my dear ex-husband that is kind of funny, kind of informative, and it doesn't really make him look bad. Right after the birth of my second child, she was about 6 weeks old, and looking back, that was kind of a crazy thing to do, but we left her with one of my best friends because Ronnie's family was flying to California to visit their relatives, and I'd never been to California. Deep down in my soul, I always wanted to have a home in LA. So thank you, Jesus, I do. But at that time, I really wanted to go, and I don't really know why it was out of the question to take the baby. But we didn't take baby Priscilla. We left her with my great, wonderful friend Sheila, who just did an excellent job while we were away. We were away less than 2 weeks. We went to, I think we flew into Ontario, not LAX, and we stayed with his relatives in Corona. And they had, well, I'll tell you two things we did, then I'll get to the juicy part. They had a modest home. Now I remember they had a little camper trailer thing that Ronnie and I slept in. More about that soon. But one thing we did was go to the beach. And we went to Newport Beach. And we just went to the beach. We didn't, go shopping at the shishi shops, none of that stuff. We went to the beach and we had a blast because his relatives had teenage boys, and it was just a lot of fun. We also went to Disneyland. And the reason I mention that is because that was also fun. Although today you would literally have to pay me to go to Disneyland. I'm not wild about crowds unless they're watching me in a movie or a web series or something, I don't know. But at that point, I really enjoyed it, having never been. And we went to the haunted house. We went to all the stuff. And we also went inside a kitchen shop or a gourmet shop. And I just thought it was just so precious. And at that particular time in the 70s, little gourmet shops, kitchen shops were popping up all over the country. And I thought I would love to open one of these shops. So that's why I mentioned that, because I will soon open one of those shops. Now, getting back to the kind of funny part. Ronnie and I hadn't dated much of anyone except each other. I mean, I think he had had sex probably with a few girls. I had had sex with one other person, and turned out to be really he was a nice guy, and I don't really know why I broke up with him and went back with Ronnie, but that was kind of a traumatic experience for me, but that was because of Ronnie. Anyway, Ronnie and I didn't have much experience with sex. We did the good old missionary position. I'm not even sure we did doggy style. We certainly didn't do anal sex. And we had done oral sex, but we'd never done the 69. And we discovered that sexual position in Corona, California, I guess in 1973 or 74 maybe. Keeping in mind, my oldest child was with us, but we made sure she wasn't with us when this was going on. But, every day, once we discovered it, I'm not even sure how we discovered it. We were obviously making love, and suddenly one end led to another, if you know what I mean, and it just happened. And wow, it was so salacious and so, oh my God, what are we doing? And it just became terribly erotic. So Ronnie and I made it a habit while we were there. Every afternoon, we would just go take a nap in the little camper truck. And that's what we would do. So I'm not quite sure why I had to mention that. But I think we'll just call this the 69, because that's what it was. Thank you for listening. Okay, let's move on back to getting a divorce from Ronnie. In Arkansas at that time, you could get a divorce in 30 days. That's right, a month. I don't know if that's still true, but, and I hate to admit this, but after filing for divorce, I very mistakenly let Ronnie, the damn fool, back into my bed one weeknight. And I don't mean weekday, I mean WEAK night. And I instantly became pregnant, of course. I became pregnant so easily that looking back, I think I could have easily had 12 or 15 kids. I had easy pregnancies, no morning sickness, hardly at all. Had the babies really fast, got pregnant very easily, but I didn't want to get pregnant this time. It's so funny that I could have had so many kids and that I've spent so many years teaching so many kids when I didn't even necessarily want one. But children have always surrounded me, and I definitely love the biological children that I have and my grandchildren, and I love kids. And I'm surprisingly damn good with them. Maybe I didn't want to have any children because I never got to be a child because I was always taking care of my mother, who was emotionally an infant. At some point I really wanted to be the kid, and not in high school or even college, but after my parents died and I got my divorce, I finally did get to experience my long overdue adolescence, me and my OCD, and no, I would not recommend it. I may have mentioned this before, but try to have your adolescence during adolescence, in your teens. It's just so much more, it's just so much less complicated. Not when you're newly divorced with 2 young children. Okay, well, getting back to this pregnancy, I knew I couldn't have that baby. So I knew I needed to miscarry. I didn't know much about miscarriage at that point, but I knew I somehow had to do that because if I had an abortion, it could be complicated because I was technically still married. So I decided that the best way to miscarry was to continually jump as many times as I could down the steps of my split-level house. And lo and behold, after many days of such practice, it actually worked. It was only about 5 steps, but if you jump down them about, 50 times a day, something could happen. And it was definitely the very beginning of the pregnancy. So one day, I was on the toilet, or as we used to call it, the commode, and I nonchalantly passed a rather big clot of blood. And that was that. That was my miscarriage. Thank you, God. That was also the real beginning, I guess, of my freedom from Ronnie, and soon after, Arkansas. But OCD would continue to run my life for life so far at that point. And I still had a little money from my inheritance from my parents, and I hadn't forgotten that gourmet store from Disneyland. And so I used that money to open a gourmet store or gourmet shop in Little Rock. As I mentioned, such stores were popping up all over the country. They included what is called tabletop, cutlery, dishes, kitchen paraphernalia, some spices, no real food. And I named my shop. I called it the Breakfast Room. I opened that store because in my mind it was simply the thing to do at the time, so I did. That was the same reason I chose to get married, the same reason I chose to major in special education in speech therapy or speech pathology. After all, that's what the contestants on Miss America were doing back then, and I guess, sadly, that was good enough for me at the time. My dad had always wanted me to be a linguist. I think because he saw how much they made interpreting when he was in the Air Force. And I never took that seriously until I had this professor in college who took a special interest in me for whatever reason. Well, one reason is probably because I was a straight A student throughout his class, because with my OCD, I regularly studied 24/7 daily. My poor mother, there was nothing she could do but watch as I studied my life away. I didn't really even have to study for finals because I studied every other day, every day. Anyway, he was a very difficult teacher. He was just a freshman history teacher. at the University of Central Arkansas. No one wanted to be in his class because it was so difficult. But of course I excelled because I'm an overachiever and with OCD. So taking an interest in me, he tried to convince me to change my major to languages, which, looking back, I'm sure he thought would be more challenging, and certainly it would have been. But I remember foolishly calling my erstwhile dumbass high school Spanish teacher, whom I had 3 years of Spanish with in high school, and asking her opinion about changing my major from education to languages. In essence, I asked her, do I have the background to do this successfully? Well, she quickly said no. And I, under the influence of OCD and God knows what else, believed the bitch. And I never changed my course of study. Let me tell you, I have often wondered what would have happened, how different my life would have been, especially had I become a linguist, like my father wanted. In fact, my father told me that that's what he wanted me to get my degree in, maybe beyond a bachelor's, a master's, a doctorate, whatever, and that he would give me away to a gorilla as long as I had my college degrees. But looking back at that, I want to paraphrase the renowned Robert Frost. His poem went something like this: 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the road less traveled, and that has made all the difference. Well, in my case, I took the road most traveled, and here we are. So I did open my store, my breakfast room. At this point, I was changing pretty rapidly. Unfortunately, my OCD was still pretty rampant, but I was growing. I was becoming healthier, even with the OCD. I managed my store myself for a while because it was really just a little shop. I don't even remember the square footage on it. I do remember that I went to Dallas to actually buy the supplies for the store. On that trip, I met my best friend to this day who was from LA, and I mean, that was perfect because that's where I wanted to live anyway. So it was really lovely meeting her in Dallas and getting to know her. And she supplied salt and pepper mills for my store. I also met a Jewish supplier. I found out there were a lot of Jewish people in sales in Dallas or were at the Dallas show, and had my first Jewish lover. Oh well, enough about that right now. Anyway, I bought the store. Also, someone I met in Dallas was a designer, a store designer. And the only thing that I really wanted from him was, I think, his body. And I could tell he was talented. And he laid out a plan for my breakfast room. And so I let him design my store. And that's all he did, was design the store. But I did kind of have a crush on him. But this was really the first time in my life that I really thought I could do anything. Now I know I can. My consciousness was actually just emerging, and it was exciting. I mean, even with the OCD, it was exciting. I even started writing my own commercials for my little pots and pans store. And let me get back to the managing of the store. I soon became very bored with that. Also, I just didn't like dealing with the general public. I'm going to sound so elitist. Later I was in sales, and I was selling to businesses. That's much easier. It's much more civilized than the general public. I also got my real estate license much later, and again had to deal with the general public, which I didn't like. I basically like children and animals, although I do have some really good friends that I can count on 2 hands, actually. But I didn't want to manage the store by myself anymore. At least I didn't want to be up front at the counter. So what I ended up doing was hiring a couple of my friends, a couple of their friends. So I had about a staff of 5. And I became really close to these ladies. And I just stayed in the back primarily and rode around town with my little white Beetle bug, my little VW, and looked really cute. I had I had an afro. My hair was auburn then, for real. And I just thought I was hot shit. What can I tell you? So I did start writing my own commercials, like I think I said, for my store. First, they were on the radio. This is just Little Rock, Arkansas, but it was the biggest thing I knew at that point. And then I even did TV commercials there. And then I wrote a jingle for the store, for the breakfast room, just to give you a little taste of it, what I remember. You're invited to the breakfast room today. We'll try to make you happy, then send you on your way. There was lots more, but I don't remember anymore. But the important point here is that I suddenly thought of myself as a writer. I knew I wasn't a great singer. I'm certainly not now because I'm so out of practice. But I could hold a key, I could hold a pitch, but I could write. And what miraculously followed was 5 years of songwriting. Once I started writing those jingles, I moved right on to songs. And naturally, I moved on to country songs, not because, although having grown up around country music, it wasn't that I liked it, but it was easy to write. And truly, at that point in my life, the heavens seemed to open up, thank God, giving me both the lyrics and the music simultaneously. I was much more of a lyricist, a writer, than I was a composer. So the music was simple, but I was very prolific. I almost sold one of my songs called Give Me a Little Love, Give Me Enough. And one weekend, I decided that I would take Nashville by storm in my gold outfit, topped off by my gold lame boots. And at that time in Nashville, they had what was called Music Row. I have no idea what Nashville is like now because I haven't been in years and years and years. But I went on that street, Music Row. I went from record label to record label until I was finally able to get by one of the receptionists who let me see the producer. The receptionists were truly the gatekeepers. Some of them were just very bitchy, and it was really difficult to get by one. But like I say, I ran into a kind one, and I did get through to see a producer. I did have a very brief fling with him, but he was I don't even remember his name, but he made his living as a music producer in Nashville. And he listened to my songs, but what was interesting is that although I had begun writing country songs, I guess I didn't have the confidence to, that trip to Nashville anyway, to bring anything with me. We had cassette tapes then, except a cassette of published songs. So I remember I brought one that was a song by recorded by Olivia Newton-John that I sang. I did Evergreen, which Barbra Streisand also did. I did a Linda Ronstadt song. I had about 5 of them. And I think I just stayed overnight and I returned to Little Rock. And I got a call from this producer who, to this day, is a friend of mine. And he said to me, we already have an Olivia Newton-John. I need some original music. Well, I don't know why I had to wait to hear that to feel free to actually let people hear my original songs. And I never did sell a song, like I said, but I did come close with that one. But I must have written and recorded at least 25 or 30 songs in Little Rock, in Dallas, in New York later, in San Francisco, in LA. And although I didn't sell a song, I will say that studio time, recording in the studio, when it's good, if you have great musicians, which I did, and if you have a good producer, which I was fortunate to have, usually, really being in that booth was as good as good sex. And I used to really love sex. So for me to say something like that or to feel like that at that point, that was big. So now I was doing country music. I was still doing some commercials. One thing I have to mention, which is really rather comical, but at that time it felt very real and very possible. You know, those periods in your life or those moments when you think anything is possible? I still do deep down feel that. And this was one of those times. I was recording some original music. I was in Dallas, and actually I had moved to Dallas to open my second gourmet store. I had put money down for a lease on this store. God knows who was going to run it. I guess I was. It had not bought the supplies for the store, but that's why I moved to Dallas with my two babies. But I also was still into doing commercials and for my store, and also especially writing country songs. And I remember I was recording a country song or two that day in a Dallas studio, and the musicians were great, studio musicians. And the song I was recording was it's the only blues song I think I ever wrote, and it was called Mr. Loose. See if I can remember any of it. It was rather an erotic little song, but it was a blues song. It was pretty good. I guess today, if I was going to do anything with any of my songs, that's the one I would look at. But it was, hey, Mr. Loose, come with me tonight. We'll get stoned and we'll do it right. And with any luck, I'll make you stand up when I sang you my prettiest song. Then the bass came in. It was just really a pretty cool song. Well, we did a version of it. We did one run through of it. And then everything stopped in the studio. And I thought, what is up? And I looked out of the booth into the producer's office or the producer's booth. And I saw everyone huddled around, and I said, what's up? And then suddenly the producer just got on the mic and said, Elvis Presley just died. And like I said, as comical as it may sound, I, in my current state of mind, took that to mean a passing of the torch. A star has died, and now a star is born. Me, with perhaps a little OCD thrown in, but that is what I thought. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to Authentically Debz. And if you like my show, please subscribe, leave a review, and definitely tell a friend. Oh, and make sure to visit my website where you can keep up with my current projects, learn a little more about me, and follow my latest news. And that website is www.deborahjangray.com. The spelling is DEBORA, no H, JANGRAY. And most importantly, blessings to everyone.